Welcome to a very special Working on Wellbeing live panel discussion. I'm so excited for this episode because this is a bonus episode. It's something we've never done before. My name is Sarah Cunningham. I am the host of the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement. And to celebrate the launch of season 3 of the podcast, we're having this very special live panel discussion with 3 wellbeing experts who have already watched the episode that went live today, and they're ready to share their insights. But just before I introduce them, I do want to say a very, very big thank you to the incredible team I get to work with at the World Wellbeing Movement, without whom none of this would be possible. And I want to say a particular shout out to Charlotte Day and Jonathan Whitney, who are very much the behind the scenes champions that make all of this happen. And I also want to thank our brilliant podcast partner, Go Create Academy. I should say that this is the first time we're trying this format. So we're trying lots of new features. I'll hopefully be able to read out some questions live from our audience and pitch them to our panel. And also we'll play some live video clips. So we're trying out a new format. Do bear with us and be patient if there are any technical hiccups, and hopefully all will go smoothly. And with that, I am so excited to introduce our panel. Now, I mentioned that our panel have already watched today's episode. Today's episode is with Dan Buettner. Many of you will already be familiar with Dan Buettner's really important work and research on the blue zones communities. So those parts of the world where people live extraordinarily long and healthy lives. You may have seen his Netflix documentary or read his book, which is behind my head. And actually, there's clues to our panelists on either side of Dan's book as well. Dan is an explorer with National Geographic. He's an author, he's a broadcaster, and so much more. And to discuss the many insights that arose in his episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Chris Cummings, who is the CEO of Wellbeing at Work, by Jen Fisher, who we announced this week as our new World Wellbeing Movement US brand ambassador. Jen is a trailblazing leader in work wellbeing, as is Chris, and as is our other guest, Jan. So Professor Jan Emmanuel Deneve is a co-founder of the World Wellbeing Movement. He's the director of the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford, and he's an author. His book that's already out is behind me, and I got a pre-sneak of his upcoming book, which comes out in March. So that's behind me as well. You are all so welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, delighted. It's just so thrilled to have 3 wonderful people who I've had the opportunity to learn so much from over the past few years, joining me to share your insights today. It feels really apt. So with that, why don't we dive in? So the conversation I had with Dan was incredible. And we discussed everything from the learnings from that Blue Zones research that can help all of us at an individual level. We discussed changes we can make in our environment, how to improve employee well-being, and how governments can actually improve well-being of the population at scale. So we'll hopefully follow that format. And I might ask for clip number 1 to be played, please.
What we clearly see in blue zones and elsewhere around the world, that people who have a strong sense of purpose live about 7 years longer than people who are rudderless. That people who are surrounded by 3 to 5 friends they can count on a bad day, those people are living 8 years longer than people who are lonely in the world. And people live in environments where they're nudged into moving. Walkable communities, for example, those people live somewhere between 3 and 5 years longer than people who are sedentary. So Blue Zones gives us some very clear and many of them right under our noses, but largely under celebrated ways for us to very easily add extra years without costing us money.
So, sense of purpose, friendships, communities, walking more, walkable communities. Lots in that, but I'm joined by three wellbeing experts here, and I'd love your thoughts and reflections on that. Chris, can I start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and great to be here. Can I just say that I was blown away by Dan's podcast, so I'd highly recommend everyone to tune in on that. So I guess I come from it from a workplace point of view, and workplaces, in my view, are communities. It's a collection of people who have shared values and hopefully a shared sense of purpose. So really activating those communities within workplaces, we can really do so much. Creating sub-communities where we bring people with common interests together, having walking meetings. I do that quite a lot, and get up and move. But those common friendships and common interest groups. There's ERGs in organisations, employee resource groups, which will highlight particular areas. But I really think we can cultivate more friendships, we can cultivate more relationships within the workplace using those sub communities. And a lot of it is very low cost. So it's not about spending huge amounts of money. We can really create that. So that would be my take on that.
Chris, thank you so much. And I might actually ask, because you brought up such a relevant point, and I'd love to go to Jen on this. Could we play clip number 3, which I think builds on Chris's point?
The number one driver of whether or not an employee likes his or her job is not how much they get paid, not if there's free cappuccino or whatever at the break stations. It's whether or not they have a best friend at work. Mm. Now, if I'm the CEO of a company and I have that insight and I'm interested in retaining my employees and making them more productive, I'm going to create a program that tries to connect my employees in a meaningful way.
I see all three panelists nodding your head on this one. Jen, can I go to you next?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that he's spot on, right? That can't be understated. And there has been so much research about this. I know that you've had Dr. Robert Waldinger as a guest on one of your previous episodes. But he and his team have led research that in our broader life, having friends, having meaningful relationships is the number one predictor of our long-term health and happiness. And so if you think about that and you relate it to the workplace, and most of us spend many of our waking hours at work, not having a best friend or a close friend at work is detrimental. It's not only detrimental to the person themselves as an individual human being, which we should care about, but it's detrimental to the organization and the bottom line of the organization. Because if I wake up and I have a friend at work or a couple of friends at work, that does give me meaning and purpose. It gives me excitement that I'm going to be spending time with people that I genuinely like and want to connect with, that I care about. If I don't have a friend at work or a couple of friends at work, I'm kind of like, I'm less dedicated, I'm less motivated. And that shows up in my work. It shows up in my loyalty to the organization. It shows up in a lot of ways, not to mention, kind of like I said, the detriment to the individual person themselves.
And Jen, I couldn't agree more. Jan, I see you nodding enthusiastically.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm going to try and add to what my fellow panelists, Jen and Chris, have so beautifully said, and add some additional nuggets of research. But let me start by saying what a huge fan I am of Dan Buettner. My God, his documentary, but especially his books and his original work, the insights he draws are mind-blowingly obvious and right there under our noses. And we've got so much to learn from the Blue Zones, both on longevity, but also happiness, because there's a lot of overlap. between the power nine, as he calls it, underpins longevity, what underpins well-being. So well-being years come together in the blue zones. So I got to know Dan actually quite well about 10 years ago, and have followed his extraordinary impact ever since. But back on to some of the things that have been touched on by Chris and Jen. Let me try and add, whether we're looking at the individual level, the workplace level, or the policy level, we find that community is always one of the key drivers, and probably one of the most understated ones. While people tend to think of income or health first when they think of personal or population level, and the same thing in workplace, when you ask people what do you think drives workplace well-being, they'll say, oh, being compensated fairly or flexibility. But really what comes to the fore every time as sort of the underdog winner is essentially a sense of belonging in the workplace. So community, having friends at work, being treated like a human being, and that happens through social connection and being able to bring your whole self to work to some extent. And it's the same thing in the World Happiness Report, which we publish here from Oxford in partnership with Gallup and the SDSN. We find that there too, it's social support, levels of social support in the countries. And that is very much related to having a friend at work. The question there that is a proxy is essentially, do you have people to rely on in times of emergency? And then a number of other items digging into social support. So at every level, individual, workplace, and population, you see the impact of community. And there's more to be said on this front, and I'm sure we'll get to it later in this discussion as well.
Thank you. And I would love to dig in more, because something that Dan said in the podcast, which resonated, was that in Japan, they have groups called, I might be mispronouncing, I believe it's moyas, where you've groups in the workplace, so sort of 4 or 5 people who organize to meet regularly, to have a meal together or to go for a walk together. And apparently the research he looked at said that actually 60% of people in that group form a really close friendship from that. And I wondered whether, I love the idea, but the cynic in me wonders, is that idealistic? Does that translate across cultures, across personalities? And you're all closer to the research than I am on this one. Jen, I might go to you first for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does, right? And I think as long as we as individuals engage in these groups and these opportunities with intention and with curiosity, I mean, I think that especially across cultures, that's where it becomes the most interesting. You know, getting to know people that are least like you or don't have something exactly in common with you are some of the most interesting relationships and friendships that you can build. I do think, though, that, you know, in the world that we live in, that's increasingly digital, we have to put a lot of intention behind this. I mean, Dan spoke about it, Jan spoke about it, that, you know, these things are under our noses, but we live in a world that actually does everything in its power to keep us you know, in front of our digital devices, to keep us from, you know, making these strong connections with other human beings. And in some cases, unfortunately, I think we take it for granted. We think that, you know, people will always be there, and so, you know, we bury our head, we bury our noses in our work and our digital devices, without thinking about the immediate term, but also the longer term impacts that it's having on all of us. And so, while it's under our noses, I do think that it requires quite a bit of intention in the world that we're living in, whether it's in our personal lives or our work lives.
I think that's a great question, and I'd love thoughts from Chris and then Jan on both building that sense of community in work and outside of work. Chris.
Yeah, I guess just thinking about the environment that organisations create to help facilitate this. You know, the amount of organisations I'll walk into, there'll be a vending machine full of chocolate and fizzy drinks. You know, you individually go and grab that, and then you go and sit at your desk and you put your earpods in and you don't connect. A real life example that I saw in Amsterdam, and I'm sure they won't mind me saying Booking.com, a fabulous environment of an office, a healthy subsidized lunch, and every single member of the whole team come together and have lunch together. They don't sit at their desk. They have a really healthy lunch. And the noise when you go in there at 12:30 every day, with the connection, the laughter, the amazing atmosphere of different departments connecting over food, and really spending that full hour connecting. And it's just incredible. And the energy, you can feel it afterwards. And look, we're not all in a position to provide subsidized lunch for 300, 400 people every day. Um, but just for helping facilitate that connection piece really made a difference, and the rewards and the financial benefits that they're seeing from that is incredible.
Chris, this is incredible because Jan has actually been doing some research on exactly this, I believe. Jan, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that research?
Well, there's a lot to be said. Let me first, while I tend to work on research relating to workplace well-being, here it becomes a lot more personal because when they talk about, I think, what they call MOIs, the Okinawa approach, what's interesting here are the numbers. These are typically 4 or 5, in the case of the documentary, most women, but the numbers are interesting. It's not the quantity, is it? It's the quality. And this, I think Jen nailed it, which is the intentionality of these relationships, the continuity of these relationships. And they don't have to be family, and they typically aren't these MOIs, as you may have gone to school with people that you stick with. And this is, for me, has been one lesson out of well-being science. So I've been at it now for, 15, 16, 17 years, well-being science. And while I'm somebody who, as I say, not necessarily as I do, one of the few things that I'm actually trying to put into practice is be more intentional about that handful, and you can probably count them on one hand, of long-term friends. And those have come mostly, frankly, through school, and I hope you still have those kind of friends. Otherwise, it's other avenues that you need to pursue, like through volunteering and other avenues that we'll talk about or that Dan talks about. But I put in an effort to the handful of old friends I have. We're all gone down very different paths, and precisely because of that intentionality of keeping in touch with each other, at least on occasions when we drop by each other's locations, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One thing, Sarah, maybe an opportunity later to talk about this in our forthcoming research for the World Happiness Report. The coming together, the intentionality, often happens around the dinner table or the lunch table. And Chris, you mentioned about people taking snacks and what have you, and then going by themselves again underneath their headphones. We'll be showing you extraordinary data, global, thanks to Gallup and the sponsorship of Ajinomoto, who sponsored a module of a global survey asking people whether they're having their lunches or dinners with other people, shared meals or not, and the extent to which they do so over lunches and dinners each week. And the results that we'll be sharing with you on March 20th, to be precise, are really quite staggering. And obviously it goes without saying, and I'm not revealing much by saying that there's a very strong correlation by the extent to which you have your lunches and dinners with other human beings and how that links to people's well-being, whether it's affective or evaluative measures. And there's some interesting sub-results, needless to say, there too, and most disconcertingly, trends that are not going in the right direction, especially in the United States.
So thank you so much. There was so much in that. You segued a little bit from community and friendship in the workplace to the power and importance of, Jen, to use your word, intentionality, which is such an important word, of nurturing our friendships who we've met throughout life. And in some ways that goes back to the individual, what we can all do ourselves to improve our well-being. And anybody who's read the documentary or watched the documentary or read the book, I hope that you have taken some tips. As I say in the podcast, my poor husband has eaten more legumes in the past year since I first watched that documentary than probably in his entire life up until that point. But that brings me maybe to clip number 2. Can I ask if that can be played, please?
We focus a lot on trying to change our conscious decision, but rather their unconscious decisions on a day-to-day basis are slightly better when it comes to what they eat or how much they move or how they socialize or how they manifest their purpose, slightly better every day for decades or a lifetime. And that's what's giving them this enormous longevity edge.
I really want to know. We have three wellbeing experts here. What nudges have you put into your own environment to sort of nudge your own positive behavior, positive decisions? And what do you recommend? And I say that what's out of shot here is my own whiteboard, which is making me, prompting me to write down how many Pilates classes I've attended this year. Should you care? I've attended 4 Pilates classes and 2 HIIT Pilates classes so far this year. But I might hand over. Who would like to go first with this one? Jen, do you want to go first?
I think my biggest nudge, and I'd love to understand from Dan and others, because it hasn't come up in any of the Blue Zones research, but my biggest nudge is get a dog. If you get a dog, you got to go out for a walk, right? Gets you outside, gets you in nature. It actually forces you, as an introvert, it forces you to talk to other people, because I know all the dogs' names, but I don't know the humans' names that walk their dogs. So it does kind of force you to take off those headphones and look eye to eye with another human being and at least say good morning or good afternoon. How are you doing? And what's your dog's name? And so there is some forced interaction there. So for me, I think that is probably my biggest nudge: get a dog and go for a walk. But otherwise, the other big thing that I do is put it on my calendar. Whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, workout, take a nap, whatever it is. If it's for me and my own self-care, it's on my calendar, and it's available for my teams to see, to help them, encourage them to do the same.
Oh, I love that. Scheduling self-care and getting a dog. Chris.
Well, I'm sorry to be boring, but I'm going to completely agree with the 2 points that Jen said. So, as a fellow dog owner and a fellow introvert, rain, wind, or shine, that dog wants to go out for a walk. So, you have to go, and it's great. And the calendar, absolutely, it's the work calendar as well. It's non-negotiables. If I'm going to do spin, it goes in. If I'm going for a walking meeting, it goes in. If I'm just going to go for a walk in nature, it goes in. We have, like many of us, you have team members putting meetings in all the time, and if it's blocked, it won't go in. So yeah, they're my non-negotiables, and just even if it's just a coffee and a walk with a colleague, it doesn't have to be a reason behind that. It still goes in, and then it's non-negotiable. It doesn't come out of my calendar.
I love this. Now, we do have a professor of behavioral science on with us. So if we're talking about nudges, it just doesn't seem right to not go to you, Jan. But I do want to ask our audience, because you should be able to type in comments. I'd love to know everybody's nudges. And we're hoping that through the magic of technology, if you send through the nudges that you put in your own environments, that we might be able to bring some of them up on screen. But Jan, a professor of behavioral science, what are your nudges?
Oh God, because it's not just behavioral science, it's economics. And so my nudges were implementing and improving tax compliance in Belgium is my biggest study on nudges. So I'm not sure how that fits with Dan Buettner, but we introduced social norms and simplification to get Belgians to pay their taxes on time. But on more personal and well-being type of nudges, I'm learning a lot here. Jen and Chris, I've always wanted to have a dog, and I might not wait anymore now. Try and convince the rest of the family. So that's that. I so agree, and I'd be interested to know when I get to see Dan or the Blue Zones team soon. I'll nudge them in that direction too. I think on our side, there's a few sort of nudges in my own personal life that link to Blue Zones. One is we do have actually big Sicilian bowls that are typically layered with fruit in the middle of the table. And the chocolatey bit, as a Belgian, chocolate is very appealing. So if it's anywhere, I will take it. So we've made sure that that's behind in a cupboard at a side. Otherwise, that would go very quickly. I try and cycle a lot, and I know Dan does the same thing. And whenever I can, rain or shine or rain, mostly rain in this case, or around here, I will try and use the bicycle. And then I think an interesting new era area or research frontier within nudging is around habits, rituals, it's typically called. And you'll see books like Atomic Habits and that kind of stuff doing really well. And I think something a habit I've inherited from my own family, which I'm now implementing in our young family at home, is on Sunday mornings, we would take more time. It wouldn't be the usual breakfast. It would typically be a bit later. My mom would press orange juices for everybody. We would go to a different table, the more formal table, and we would make sure that it's not just bread, but there's little breads that are specifically made by the baker for Sundays. And I'm now doing something similar in our family on Sundays. And it's become a habit that the kids are expecting this too. And so little Celestine, little Louis, when they wake up on Sunday, they know we'll be cooking together, essentially English breakfast, because we now live in England. And so here we are, pulling out the beans, the bacon, and the eggs on Sunday mornings. But it becomes this communal thing that is just, it's become something that's bigger than me. And the kids love it. And then we stand around and they break the eggs and wheel around and the bake with the baked beans. So I know it sounds a bit silly, but that has become a bit of sort of a ritual / nudge, which is working, and it takes out time and brings the family together.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. All of these are so inspiring. And also, some of our audience have shared some of the nudges that they put in their own environment as well. And I should say that immediately after that clip that we showed, Dan Buettner does share more nudges. And actually, Jan, his fruit bowl is in there, as you probably know. And also some interesting nudges around putting your toaster in the cupboard as opposed to on your counter. But I want to call out what some of our viewers have. So Nessa O'Gorman, when she makes a cup of tea, does 10 squats, which I think is amazing. Jennifer Gill agreeing wholeheartedly with Jen and Chris around, yes, everything is on the calendar. So that's wonderful. Actually, a couple of here as well. Sharon says, exercise first thing in the morning. I love the feeling of starting with the most important thing done. I run and prepare everything the night before to make sure it happens down to the minutest detail. Sharon, I wish I could say I was at that level myself. I shall only aspire to that. I think that's incredible. But interestingly as well, a couple of comments here around the conversation we're having about workplace well-being. And there's one that it sort of leads to a question here, where Janice very, very sagely said that workers are also looking for purpose in their work. And I wholeheartedly agree, and I know the research does as well. Who wants to take that? Who wants to talk to that? Jen, I see you smiling.
I'm always, I mean, what I mean, yes, there's a ton of research behind that, and I'll let the researcher speak to it. But I mean, who wouldn't want that, right? But I do think that it has become and will continue to become even more important to modern day workers. I mean, we're seeing it come up more and more, that workers want meaning and purpose in their work. They want to understand, the broader impact, societal impact that organizations are making beyond, I know there's a discussion in the podcast around GDP, but, just beyond just revenue, what are organizations doing for the greater good of society, for the greater good of humanity? They want to know that matters to the organization, and they want to be a part of it. They don't want to just know that it matters. They want to contribute to it, and they want, that to know that the work that they're doing, or at least while they're at work or when they're at work, they will have an opportunity to contribute to something that feels meaningful and purposeful and bigger than themselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And nor could Dan, actually. So I might ask for clip number 4, if that's all right. Can we get clip number 4?
Well, number one, volunteering. I wrote this other book called The Blue Zones of Happiness, and looking at worldwide data from the from the World Poll. I know you know that well. Around the world, people who volunteer report higher levels of life satisfaction. They also tend to have lower healthcare costs and lower rates of BMI. So very easy way to augment your social circle is volunteer at a place that shares your values. And a nice byproduct of that is that the people you meet are likely to share your values and more likely to become long-term friends.
Chris, I might go to you because, of course, through your work as CEO at Wellbeing at Work, you meet so many employees and leaders from so many different workplaces. Are you seeing that a lot of workplaces are now offering volunteering, and what are your reflections on this?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that. What's interesting about what Dan said as well, which I really was surprised about, that volunteering lowers BMI. I thought that was really fascinating. I'd like to know how. So, um, yeah, certainly. Providing some of those key skills from organisations, providing that to the third sector, really is a win-win on both sides. The employee really comes back energised. Obviously, the charity involved is getting great skills that often they can't afford as that skill set. But also, I don't think we need to necessarily, just from a personal level, I don't think we necessarily need to have it completely structured. I have a neighbour in her 80s. She's on her own. We have movie nights together. It's not classed as volunteering, but we just hang out and we have that connection. Now, you could class it, I suppose, as volunteering to help this person, but it's building up that friendship and looking out for people in your own neighbourhood and community. And there's lots of, another charity that I do stuff with. You go and spend time with an hour a week with someone who has Alzheimer's, and you just go for a walk with them. So it's those sort of things, as well as the more structured piece that organisations can do. Honestly, I get more from it than my neighbour or the person I'm walking with. Trust me, it's so energising.
It's incredible, Chris. And love the movie night as well. Absolutely love that. I'd love to also ask those of you who are viewing, do please let us know what you do to volunteer, or that really uplifts you. Somebody here, Dr. Simon Madney, has said our organisation gives a certain number of hours each year to volunteer in a purposeful activity of their choice, and additional incentives to volunteer. And you've talked about volunteering in the community. Jan, I believe there was some research a few years ago based on, was it the NHS call for volunteers? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, and I'll also come back to some of the points just raised by that excellent submission, and also Chris's. So it was our friend Christian Krekel at the LSE, colleague and friend, who published what I think is probably the strongest evidence to date on the impact of volunteering on one's own well-being, which is, as Chris was alluding to right at the end when he spoke, is like, I might actually benefit more from this than the people I'm trying to help. And that's been shown to be, I'm not sure about the relative balance, but it's clearly been shown causally now that doing well for others also helps you and your own well-being. The way that Chris Krekel did this was, in COVID, the National Health Services here in the UK provided, it's quasi costless, but they provided an opportunity, an app, an official NHS app for people to sign up to then be part of volunteers that can help and visit and bring groceries around. It was oversubscribed. More wanted to volunteer than were needed, and there was possibility. So what Chris Krekel did is to essentially have a randomized control trial between those that got in and those that were on the wait list to be able to help, and then track the life satisfaction, the well-being, if you will, of both the waitlisted control group and the actual treatment group. And what he found is obviously what we now know is that people actually their own well-being benefited from doing the right thing for others as well. And that's really, really powerful. And Chris, what you're saying, and I know, Jen, you've seen these programs in action as well, and this listener just put it in, especially if it's self-directed, if you allow employees to jointly, and again, with intentionality, like Jen would put it, think about what local charity typically they would want to do. And the other condition that helps is then do together. So it's not just everybody chooses a charity that they would like to work for and then get given time off to do so. Ideally, you have one or two of these local charities that are chosen by the team in the workplace, and then they help out in teams so that there's also a bonding potentiality between workers as they go about that volunteering day, for example. So that has shown, and Sarah, our colleague Will Fleming here at our Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre, in his famous study where he evaluates some of these sort of more individualistic interventions to try and improve well-being, that is the one that actually stood the test of his analyses.
Yeah, and it was a really important piece of research, actually. And I think I see Jen nodding your head, so I want to go to you on this one, Jen, because there's a couple of points. One, building on, thank you for bringing up Will's research, which really showed that all those individual level interventions, actually, you need something more powerful. You need organizational level interventions first, and only then layer on top the individual level ones. But Jen, one of the challenges we've seen in the workplace is workplaces doing these things, saying, look, you get 2 or 3 paid volunteer days a year, you can, do all these things, and employees not actually having time to sign up. What's your view on how to encourage, and support people in being able to sign up and benefit from it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, and I love William Fleming's research because it I think really put a lot of data behind what many of us working in the field kind of knew and felt for a long time, that not that these individual interventions aren't important, but if you're not creating the right culture, the right levels of empowerment, and you're not giving people the space to take advantage of these interventions, these programs, these tools, these resources that you are spending money on, and then I think what many of us on the phone have probably experienced in talking with some of these leaders in organizations that genuinely care about people's well-being and are investing in people's well-being, and then they're failing to kind of see a hard ROI on it, right? And so it's not I don't think it's an either or, it's an and. It's don't stop investing, but what's the and to the equation? How do we create the right environment so that people do feel empowered, that people do? And I think honestly, a lot of this goes back to where we started. If you have friends at work, if you have people that you enjoy spending time with, and there is a volunteer opportunity, and Sarah wants to go to the volunteer opportunity, she's going to say, hey, Jen, come along with me. Hey, Chris, come along with me, right? And so, I think that, all of this kind of comes full circle. It's all certainly interconnected, but I do think that there's an and. I do think that we need to be looking at, the cultural barriers, the systemic barriers, the ways in which people are getting work done. And some of these things might be, perceived. They're not necessarily real. I think sometimes it's people's perception of what is acceptable here or what is celebrated here, more so than that there will be any judgment if I do this or I don't do this, right? And so I think there needs to be clear and consistent communication around these things, that we invest in it because we want you to take advantage of it. And if you can't take advantage of it, then that probably requires a broader conversation around what does your workload look like, or what's going on a broader level that you're unable to take advantage of the things that the organization is providing for you, because we know that that's good for you and that's good for the organization. There's still a lot of work to be done there. But we're talking about it. I think there's movement in the right direction. But I, for one, am incredibly grateful for William Fleming's research on that, because it just opened up the conversations that we need to be having with a lot of data behind it.
Yeah, here. And, speaking to that sense of belonging in the workplace, it really is huge. And I know, Jan, that bubbles to the top of your research as well. You've done some research looking at the world's largest study of employee wellbeing survey data. And I think belonging bubbles to the top.
Yeah.
And of course, workload as well. Sorry, Jan, please.
Oh, no, absolutely. So thanks to the partnership with Indeed, who have crowdsourced workplace well-being at a scale never seen before, when we looked at the US data, where most of the data is being sourced, and you look at what the drivers of workplace well-being are, it's that the sense of belonging that comes right to the top. And so again, we're going full circle. And Jen put it beautifully, just in practice what it means, because a lot of these initiatives, like the volunteering one, rely on that sense of belonging in the first place to really be able to activate the benefits that Chris and Jen spoke about.
Yeah, well, we've had a few more comments come in, and I should say that for our audience, do please send questions in as well for our panel. But a few people say, so Meg here saying volunteering is so important. I found it so good for my soul. The school I went to, my headmistress had a mantra, and anybody who went to this school, imprinted on our brains for life, is what you put into it is what you get out of it. And I love that Dr. Saneh Tabnoui sent that comment in. So life is not what you get out of it, it's what you put back in, which is lovely. And Kat agreeing with that. With regards to charities and volunteering, it's important to be mindful that it doesn't end there. It's not all about you and having that feel-good feeling. It's also about how you can help to create opportunities to change lives with those who you mix with. So I thought that was such a beautiful note to segue to governments and what governments can do to create opportunity to improve lives. And this is something that I posed to Dan in the podcast, and we talked actually at length about this one. But I wonder, could we play clip number 5, please?
GDP is important, but it's a blunt instrument. It doesn't provide. You can't just hit a country with high GDP and expect people to be happy, in other words. But so GDP is one of the 4 or 5 things that really determine happiness in nations. Another really big predictor is healthy life expectancy, equality. Turns out that equal nations are happier than unequal nations controlling for everything else. Trust, being able to trust your neighbors, etc. So the problem is we become obsessively focused on growing GDP, especially in the United States here, or growing wealth. And at a certain point, the power of incremental wealth doesn't deliver much more happiness, and the costs associated with this sort of blind pursuit becomes greater, especially for the least fortunate.
Well, I think it's very powerful. I should say I'm not an economist, but thankfully we have got a professor of economics here. So, you know, most of us have heard the term GDP, gross domestic product, but may not, if I'm completely honest, don't know the complete ins and outs of it. I certainly, have a rudimentary understanding, but not everybody will. And I wondered, Jan, could I go to you and ask you to simplify? What is GDP at a high level? Why is it a blunt instrument? Why is it so flawed? And what should be the overarching measure of societal progress?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Sarah. Gross domestic product is really the productive capacity of a country, what gets produced and what gets sold. So it's essentially the summation of everything that gets, all products and services that get sold on the market. But that captures everything except what probably makes life worthwhile. And I'm here paraphrasing Bobby Kennedy, who put it more beautifully than anyone else. So if you build more prisons, if you go to war, if you sell a lot of drugs or legalize prostitution, all of that will add to one's GDP. But is that what you're aspiring to measure as a measure of social progress? Probably not. What it doesn't capture is volunteering, homework, caring for each other, courage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's obviously what Bobby Kennedy beautifully spotted, but also what the person who invented what was then called the national income accounts. His name was Simon Kuznets, brilliant person. In the 40s, I think, he spoke in front of the US Congress and said, please do not take my measure as a measure of social welfare or progress in the social welfare. And so obviously what we've done is we've taken it. And in part, that's because it's a single measure, despite behind the scenes it being an index of a very convoluted, complex set of metrics. But they come out in one measure. And it's not because it's one measure. I think it was a bit of a eureka moment recently. It's not just because it's a single measure, it's because it's a relatable single measure. People think of it as essentially their own household income, but at a societal level. So if it goes up, all other things being equal, as economists like to say, it must be better. Because if I get $1,000 extra salary, for example, this year, then that must be better than not getting it. And so it's that mentality. But as Dan says, at what cost? Because it's at the cost of wars, it's the cost of environmental pollution, it could be at the cost of inequality. And he's obviously spot on a number of the things that he says. What he also notes is it's a blunt instrument, and there's diminishing marginal returns to it. And that is something that is actually at the very start of well-being economics. And it's so sad to have to say that Richard Eastland just passed away last month. And he was sort of the founder of this, and was the first one in the 60s and the 70s to pose the question. And literally, the paper was titled, "Does economic growth improve the human lot?" And he was looking at US data, very early scattered life satisfaction data. But what he found was very strong and steep increases in GDP on an annual basis, but no corresponding increases in well-being as measured through life satisfaction in the US context. Now, importantly, it's still a proxy because when economies are developing, countries with low GDP, you will see the increase in GDP will typically still correlate with increases in life satisfaction measures through, say, the surveys in the Gallup World Poll. But after a certain level, think about 20,000 GDP per capita, it becomes very tricky to still pick up a real meaningful difference between much more. And then it becomes all about
sorry to interrupt you, but can I ask a question? Is the inverse true? So if we increase well-being, will that increase GDP?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Now, obviously, if you want a causal answer to that, will be impossible, because you would have to experiment with entire nations, making some happier than others in parallel universes to then see whether GDP goes up in a nation where you've been able to manipulate people's happiness. So that's not going to happen tomorrow. However, at the individual and organizational level, we now have, since only recently, causal evidence from the field showing that how you feel, independent from how the company or how you're doing in the workplace, how you feel actually causally influences your productive capacity. So if that holds at the individual and the organization level, you could potentially extrapolate that to a population level. So there's an argument to be made that if you can raise population well-being by a number of means, including, for example, community building up the social infrastructure, as Lord Laird would say, then that may actually sort of also lead to increases in productive capacity.
Amazing. And of course, the World Wellbeing Movement, we strongly believe, backed by so much empirical rationale, that well-being should be the overarching goal of governments across the world. And I'd love to play clip number 6, if I can.
I think the biggest change, if every city had a double bottom line, A, you have to get reelected, but B, you have to measurably increase the well-being of that city, we would have a healthier world and a happier world.
So in order to get elected, we need our leaders to prove that they can improve the well-being of the city. Is that what you're saying?
They need to try. They need to try, and that should be a major sort of scorecard. Their scorecard should not just be, did we collect more taxes or create more business opportunities? Did the people in this community increase their own life satisfaction? And if the answer is yes, you get back in. And if the answer is no, well, you're on probation. Show us what you're going to do for the next term. I guarantee you we will have a healthier, more thriving world.
Now, what's pretty incredible about that clip is that one of our colleagues, Dr. George Ward, has done some research on this and found that actually population well-being is one of the biggest predictors of whether a current government will get re-elected or not. So I want to go to you, Chris, and I want to ask, if every politician on the planet was aware of this, and if every politician's goal was to improve the well-being of people, what do you think would change in public policy, in election campaigns? What would be the biggest change you'd expect to see?
Well, I'd love it to happen, and I wouldn't be an expert in this field. I mean, I guess, when you go to the ballot box, you do genuinely, you don't think, well, I don't personally think, what's GDP doing or anything like that. It's how do I feel? Do I feel better than I did 4 or 5 years ago when these guys got in? And so that's part of life satisfaction. That's part of well-being. So it clearly plays a role. I don't know about evidence, and I don't know, whether this has been studied, but clearly people are, if you're feeling as though life is better, your well-being has improved, I think that plays a big part, and I'd be interested to see if there was any studies around that, because hopefully then we would see governments and politicians really taking this more seriously.
Amazing. And perhaps when we post the replay, there was a question, will this replay be left available? It will. Perhaps we might also put a link to George's research in that, because I think it's so important. Jen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the podcast, Dan, went on to say, or perhaps it was you, Sarah, just that with George's research, exactly what Chris said. I mean, it might not be what we talk about in our elections, but when people go to the ballot box, the first thing they do think is how do I feel? And so in some regards, we are already electing officials based on how we feel about our own life satisfaction. I guess my broader question or reaction when I was listening to this was about this concept of life satisfaction, because we live in a world that's constantly telling us that we're not satisfied or that we shouldn't be satisfied. And so how do we actually know what life satisfaction is? I mean, maybe I'm asking that for personal reasons, right? Because it's like, we're bombarded, and Dan talks a lot, these marketing engines, we're bombarded with messaging to tell us that we need this or we need that, or we're not successful until we have the bigger house or the this or the that. And so how do we actually know if we're satisfied, and what life satisfaction? And so I don't know, Jan, maybe you have an answer to that. But that was kind of my reaction, was just this reflection on, wow, do I actually, if I was to step back and think about it in my own terms, for me, for Jen Fisher, what is life satisfaction? Because we're just constantly bombarding us with messages that tell us that we're not satisfied.
Jen, you've become really philosophical there, and you threw a question to Jan that I'd love to get.
I know, and we probably don't have time for an answer for it, so I'm sorry.
No, but we deal with it a lot, because obviously what this life satisfaction question, or the Cantor letter of life to be more precise, underpins the World Happiness Report. So we get this all the time. And so, Jen, you're quite right. So what we see is, of course, people's response to whether they're satisfied with their lives is very much influenced by these social comparison and adaptation. So the hedonic treadmill, so you adapt to improvements in life, and you adapt also to your social comparisons. And in a US context where you're bombarded with these ads, they play in specifically on the hedonic treadmill and the social comparison, as you said yourself. And that depresses people's scores on life satisfaction, their self-rated quality of life. And so that's really, really, if well-being, on a policy front, Sarah, if well-being were to be put central in policy, then we would have to take, frankly, a much closer look at how and what we bombard people with day in, day out, and take a closer look at what's actually ruining people's lives rather than helping them.
That's really interesting. I do have a few questions from the audience here. So I have one question here from Susan, who wants to know, how can we convince governments to go beyond GDP? So this might take an hour and a half, so we're going to have the rapid fire answer to this in the time remaining. Jan, if you were to whittle that down to 3 key things that you think could work to convince governments to move beyond GDP, what would they be?
Well, it's first measure what you treasure, because what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And we're making good headway on that. So the Office for National Statistics in the UK has good measures. The US is lagging massively on this front. The OECD is pushing this hard. So there's measurements around this. So a bit like what you and Dan were talking about. If only they would be more, but then it's not just the measure, then it's the promotion of these measures, so that the journalists and people and newspapers write about, okay, Mr. Biden was in the office, or Mr. Trump was in the office, and over that 4-year period, life satisfaction has improved by this much or has decreased. So we need this to be at the same level as GDP. Today in the United Kingdom, there was a lot of hurraying because GDP had gone up by 0.5%. We want, in that same news outlet, complementary to GDP, we would need to, and life satisfaction has come up by 1.2% or something like that. That's what we need. If that becomes as big as GDP, then we're on to something. And then the links, as Chris nicely described, the evidence is there now, thanks to George's work, the links to voting should hopefully incentivize the politicians to actually take this a hell of a lot more seriously, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Jan. I'm aware we're into the final minutes, and I do want to get some audience questions answered rapid fire. So I've had a question here: how can remote workers build friendships at work? Chris or Jen, I'm going to look to either of you for a rapid fire answer to that.
I mean, my rapid fire is be intentional about it. Be intentional, block time on your calendar specifically to reach out to people, to schedule time with people. And make sure that it is part of what you do on a weekly basis at a minimum.
Thank you. Chris, any advice on how do you get global companies to take well-being seriously? And I'd love to go to Chris and then Jen with this one. They all tick the boxes, i.e. offering employee assistance programs, but if belonging within the workplace is low, surely we need more on-the-ground services within the company.
More evidence of success, and sharing of that success. The great work that you've done with the research around the share price and the speaking to leaders about the evidence, because ultimately leaders want successful companies, and successful companies have well-being as their foundation.
And this, Chris, you've mentioned Jan's research, and it is really compelling. Jan, can you give us the elevator pitch of that research on the stock market performance?
I'm happy to. So looking at all listed companies in the US that we have comparable data for, about 1,800 of them, and you rank order companies by the best places to work for, as surveyed through crowdsourced surveys, so genuine. And you rank order these companies, and you take the top 100, top 50, you'll find that those data then become leading indicators of stock market performance in the subsequent year if you invest according to those. So that is a very exciting sort of set of results. It shows that how people feel in the workplace translates into bottom line impact. And that happens by way of 3 pathways to performance: productivity, retention, and recruitment. And those 3 pathways together come raise firm performance as a whole.
Thank you, Jan. Jen, I'm going to go to you as we're just coming up on the hour for the final word on all of these questions, particularly around workplace wellbeing, because I think you were possibly the first ever Chief Wellbeing Officer, certainly the first I'm aware of. So you've got a hell of a lot of expertise in this area.
Yeah, I mean, we just have to keep using our voices, using the data. I think that it's really important. Also, I provide guidance. Know your audience. If you're talking to the CFO, talk to the CFO in terms of what's important to the CFO and what the CFO cares about. If you're talking to the head of HR, talk in terms of, and so you have to do the work, you have to prepare, but we have to keep using our voices. Thanks to Jan and the Wellbeing Research Center and so many others. When I started, there wasn't concrete data. There was no data, as a matter of fact. So I used data from high-performing sports teams. We now have the workplace data, and it is powerful and it's compelling. So use it and use your voice.
I couldn't agree more. I haven't got through all the questions, so I do apologize. But thank you to everybody who's taken the time to listen in and to send questions. A final plug, above my head on the bookcase, you should be able to see Dan Buettner's book in the middle. Jan's book, co-authored with Professor Lord Richard Layard, who's the other co-founder of the World Wellbeing Movement, is the red one. Above that is Jan's upcoming book, which is coming out in March, on workplace well-being. So do keep an eye out for that. And we may ask Jan to be a podcast guest, along with Dr. George Ward, who's the co-author. And then the other book you'll see the other side of Dan is Jen Fisher's book. So I'm delighted to say that our next podcast episode, which will come out in 2 weeks, features Jen with the amazing Kiana Schmiedel from WorkHuman. So I know that's a goodie because I've already had that conversation. So do tune in. And Chris, can I ask you now, live on air, when you're going to write your book?
Oh, my fellow panelists' books are good enough for your reading. So maybe in a few years' time. But yeah, I'd highly recommend both because I've read them both.
Listen, thank you so much, Chris. I have to say, wealth of knowledge that I get from you and Jen from you and Jan from you. So I'm so grateful for all of your time and expertise. And thank you to our listeners. Thank you very much.